This segment will discuss the importance of using a lease that complies with Minnesota law, where to get leases, the most important components to include in the lease, and how crime-free, drug-free addendums can be used to protect you. Hear experts talk about their tips on the lease signing and how it lays the groundwork for the tenancy. The lease is a legally binding contract between the tenant and the property owner. It is important that your lease is in writing and that it complies with Minnesota law. Taking the time to walk through the lease with a new tenant will help ensure that everyone has the same understanding and expectations. Minnesota tenant-landlord law addresses the rights and responsibilities of both the property owner and tenant relative to the lease.
I look at a lot of leases in my job. When I talk to tenants, they send their lease in and I look at it, and I can tell a lot about a landlord by the lease they use. And there's landlords that simply find a lease, I think, on the internet or go to like an office supply store and they'll pay a couple dollars for a lease. It's actually terrible for the landlord. As I mentioned, landlord-tenant law is almost all state law driven. These internet-type leases or nationally created leases were not written for Minnesota. They were written for as many states as possible, trying to be as inclusive as they could. And in general, those leases take away a lot of landlords' rights. Whenever I look at a landlord-tenant problem, I always think of it as kind of an equation. There's three parts to the equation. You have the law, plus the facts, plus the lease. And that gets you the answer. The only one of those three the landlord has any control over, generally, is the lease. And so a landlord should have the strongest lease they can come up with.
If I was a new landlord in this industry, the first call I would make is to Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. They have a lease that has passed the plain language contract law, which is required of a lease. It is simple, and it is in the best interest of both you and the resident. It outlines when rent is due, what is the resident's responsibility and rights. You want it simple, you want it fair, and you want it to follow all of the laws that govern our industry.
Successful property owners have found it helpful to have their leases be as specific as possible in order to avoid any ambiguity about the landlord-tenant relationship.
I think some of the most important elements in a lease are to clearly state who is on the lease, what the rent is, what utilities are expected to be paid by the resident and or the owner. I think it needs to outline when rent is due and how to pay rent. I think it needs to outline what a resident promises, and that is not to take away the right of another resident to enjoy where they live.
Make it say exactly how much the deposit was that you collected, how much the rent is per month, if you're going to charge an extra amount for rental of the garage, make sure that is listed there. Garage rent, $25 per month. If you are very specific and very clear, then both parties understand exactly what's due. And if you wind up in a dispute about it, whoever's trying to help you solve the dispute is going to be able to understand it better. I think sometimes landlords think that they have to say it in sort of fancy legal language. Try to avoid fancy legal language. Even lawyers should try to avoid fancy legal language. But just make it very clear. The rent for this apartment number 3 is X per month. The rent for parking slot number 3 is X per month. The security deposit is this much. It was paid on this date. It doesn't have to say more than that, but it should say that if you want to later talk about disputes that involve those terms.
One of the recent changes in the landlord-tenant law is around the charging of late fees for overdue rent. It is important for a property owner to include this provision in their lease. If this agreement is not in writing, a late fee may not be assessed. The updated law also has set a maximum amount of 8% that can be charged as a late fee for overdue rent. To better understand this concept, the following examples show how the 8% maximum amount can be assessed. If rent for a unit is $700, the maximum amount that can be charged for a late fee is $56, which is 8% of $700. A second example uses the same rent of $700. A property owner accepts a partial payment of rent from a tenant of $300. The late fee could only be imposed on the balance of $400, which is the overdue rent payment. The maximum amount that could be charged for a late fee is $32, which is 8% of $400. It's important to indicate the period of time the lease is in effect. For example, the lease would include a start and end date, such as June 1st to May 31st. If it's month to month, the start would be June 1st and continue month to month with no end date.
Typically, in our industry, we see 12-month leases, but there is a practice for some owners to do month-to-month leases. The reasoning behind that is both favorable for the resident and the owner or manager, because if the situation isn't working out, either can give notice in a reasonable amount of time.
One thing that a landlord has to have in a lease, if they ever really want to enforce much of it, is what's called a reentry clause. What that means is that if the tenant violates a rule, let's say they have a pet and they're not supposed to, the lease needs to say somewhere that if the tenant violates the lease, then the landlord can enforce it by probably filing an eviction. But if they don't have that clause in there, they can't file the eviction for the pet's violation. A lot of these national leases don't have any sort of reentry clause or it's not strong enough.
Before you sign the lease, it is critical to review it with your tenant before you enter into a rental agreement. Taking the time to sit down and go through the lease before or during the lease signing with a new tenant will ensure that everyone has the same understanding and expectations.
I think in working with leases, the biggest thing is to be clear on what you're looking for and make sure that the tenant understands the lease.
The first thing I'd say about reviewing a lease is a landlord should know what's in their own lease. And surprisingly, many don't. The best ones do. They know exactly what's in their contract, and many of them will pick out the most important parts in their mind of the contract and have the tenant initial next to it, like somehow that adds credibility to the contract. The truth is, once the tenant signs the bottom line, they've agreed to the entire deal. You don't need special initials on every line showing that the tenant saw that. All it means is they wrote down their initials. It doesn't add much of anything. But a landlord should know what they really care about. And most landlords care about, this is when the rent's due. This is when the late fee kicks in. You can't have somebody living here that's not on your lease. So if you want to move somebody in, tell me, and maybe they can apply, and I'll see if they're going to pass the background check or not. So my advice on that is a landlord should know what they really want to stress to the tenant, and then stress that when they talk to them.
During lease signing, communication is essential. If, for example, a utility is required to be paid for by the resident, a good practice would be have the resident bring to your office a hookup notice to show that they have, in fact, placed that utility in their name. Take the time to go through the lease. You are required by law to give a new resident a copy of their lease. A good idea to do that is going to be a top sheet to your leasing packet that is going to have an ability to initial when you give each copy, whether it be the lease, any additional addendums. You're going to have them initial how many keys they were given and our garage door openers. This is a good tool for later on when there's a question, you can show that you did give those addendums and leases.
What I found best that works for me is when I initially meet that tenant and when we go through the approval process, once they're approved, I'll hand them a copy of a blank lease that says, here's your lease, okay? It's not filled out with any of your information. There's no numbers or anything like that in there. There's no address, there's nothing. Just a blank lease, but it's got all the verbiage in it. I tell them, you really want to get comfortable with this lease, you want to understand it, because when I do the move-in, on move-in day and it's time to sign the lease, I don't expect you to read my 13-page lease. I don't want to put them in a position where they have to just, tell them, I'll sign right here, just sign this quick. You don't want them to do that. You want them to fully understand it. Whether they read that lease or not, once you give it to them, sometimes I'm giving it to them a month ahead of time, because if they're not moving in for 30 days, I'm going to tell them, here's a dummy copy of the lease. It's just a blank lease. Please get comfortable with it. Because on move-in day, I don't want to take 3 hours to go through the lease. I'm going to have this same exact lease. We can scan over it, okay? But then I'm going to have you sign it. So please get comfortable with it. If you have questions, call me or text me, email me, whatever questions you have.
Leases may also contain addendums, specific terms or agreements that are added to the standard lease language. One common addendum is known as the crime-free, drug-free addendum.
It's a one-page lease addendum that basically has a lot of the same language that you'll find in your standard leases, but in a standard lease, usually your crime-free, drug-free section is about a paragraph long. This is one full page, and what it does, it sets the tone of the lease. And so what it does is it says, basically, this is so important, we are making its own addendum to our standard lease. And the crime-free, drug-free lease addendum has been used in Minnesota for many, many years, and it has been tested through the court process system.
By having all your tenants sign the crime-free, drug-free lease addendum prior to moving in, everyone agrees to no drug use or crime-related activity on or near the premises. This includes threats or acts of violence, loud, annoying, disruptive behavior, drug-related illegal activity. The addendum applies to anyone that lives there and their guests or other persons. A single violation could be sufficient reason to terminate the lease or file a court eviction. Using the crime-free, drug-free lease addendum shows you're an active property owner who is concerned about their rental property. This addendum may be required by your city or a housing authority. It is available for all property owners to use with their lease. The Minnesota Crime Prevention Association has additional information about this crime prevention program. As you've heard from experts, there are many facets to a successful lease signing. Remember the following. Use a well-written lease that complies with Minnesota law. Fill out the lease completely, and don't leave any blank spaces. Review and explain all the parts of the lease. Take the time for the lease signing. Check to be sure that the tenant understands the lease. Ask if there are any questions. In summary, the lease is a legally binding contract between the owner and the tenant. Everyone has responsibilities that come with this agreement. With a clearly understood lease, you'll be in a better position as a property owner to carry out the terms of the lease and deal with any problems or issues that occur during the tenancy.